The attacker had just declared, "I had to attack Kamala Harris, I made the decision alone." But the phone records in Jasmine Crockett's hand proved that behind the attack was a $15 million conspiracy involving a 47-person organized network. 44 seconds later, America would see the true face of the attack on Kamala. The House Select Committee hearing on political violence and national security had been convened in the aftermath of the most shocking attack on a sitting vice president in American history. The attempted assassination of Kamala Harris during a campaign rally in Phoenix had sent shockwaves through the political system and raised urgent questions about the protection of elected officials and the security of American democracy. For the first 3 hours, the hearing had proceeded along predictable lines. FBI Director Christopher Wray had testified about the investigation into the lone gunman, Marcus Wellington, who had been apprehended at the scene after firing 3 shots that missed the vice president by inches. Secret Service Director Patricia Chen had outlined the security failures that had allowed an armed individual to get within 200 yards of the vice president. The narrative that had emerged from law enforcement was simple and reassuring. Marcus Wellington was a mentally unstable individual who had become radicalized through online conspiracy theories and had acted alone in his attempt to assassinate the vice president. The attack was being treated as the isolated act of a deranged individual rather than part of any broader conspiracy. All available evidence points to Mr. Wellington acting alone, Director Wray had testified confidently. Our investigation has found no credible evidence of coordination with other individuals or groups. This appears to be a classic case of a lone wolf attacker motivated by personal grievances and online radicalization. The Republican members of the committee had nodded approvingly at this characterization. It fit their preferred narrative that political violence was the result of individual mental illness rather than systemic problems with political rhetoric or institutional failures. The American people need to understand, declared Ranking Member Jim Jordan, that this was not a conspiracy. This was not an organized attack. This was one disturbed individual who made a terrible decision to commit violence against an elected official. The Democratic members had asked pointed questions about security protocols and the online radicalization process, but had generally accepted the lone wolf narrative presented by law enforcement officials. But Jasmine Crockett had spent the entire hearing studying a classified intelligence briefing that painted a very different picture of the attack on Vice President Harris. The briefing, marked with the highest levels of security classification, contained evidence that completely contradicted the official narrative being presented to the committee and the American people. Director Wray, Jasmine said, her voice cutting through the comfortable consensus that had developed around the lone wolf theory. You testified that all evidence points to Mr. Wellington acting alone in this attack. Wray's expression remained confident. That's correct, Congresswoman. Our investigation has been thorough and comprehensive. I appreciate your confidence in the investigation, Jasmine replied, opening a secure folder that made several committee members shift uncomfortably in their seats. But I have some questions about evidence that appears to contradict your conclusions. The shift in tone was immediate and ominous. Jasmine wasn't asking routine questions about investigative procedures, she was suggesting that the FBI's official conclusions were incomplete or inaccurate. Congresswoman, Wray said carefully, I'm not sure what additional evidence you might be referring to, but I can assure you that our investigation has been thorough. Has it? Jasmine interrupted, lifting the first document from her folder. Because according to this NSA communication analysis, Marcus Wellington's phone records show 347 calls and 1,891 text messages with 23 different individuals in the 6 months preceding the attack. The number of communications immediately undermined the lone wolf narrative. Someone planning an isolated attack doesn't typically maintain extensive contact with dozens of people during the planning phase. Wray's expression flickered. Phone communications don't necessarily indicate conspiracy. People communicate with family, friends, work colleagues. Do they communicate with sitting members of Congress? Jasmine asked, her question landing like a bomb in the hearing room. The implication was staggering. If Wellington had been in communication with members of Congress before the attack, the lone wolf theory would collapse entirely, replaced by the possibility of a coordinated political conspiracy at the highest levels of government. "I'm not sure what you're suggesting," Ray said, but his voice carried less confidence than before. "I'm not suggesting anything," Jasmine replied, turning to another page in her classified briefing. "I'm stating facts based on NSA intercepts and FBI forensic analysis of Wellington's communications." She began reading from the document. June 15, 3 months before the attack, Wellington receives a call from a number registered to the office of Senator Marcus Chen. Duration, 47 minutes. The hearing room erupted in whispers and shifting bodies. A 47-minute phone conversation between the would-be assassin and a sitting senator was impossible to explain as coincidence or casual contact. July 2, Jasmine continued, Wellington receives encrypted messages through Signal app from accounts traced to the offices of Representatives Patricia Wilkins and Robert Morrison. Message frequency, daily for 3 weeks. With each revelation, the lone wolf narrative crumbled further. This wasn't an isolated individual, this was someone in regular, sustained contact with multiple elected officials in the months leading up to the assassination attempt. August 20, Jasmine read, Wellington participates in a conference call involving 12 participants, including phone numbers registered to congressional offices, political action committees, and private security firms. The conference call was the smoking gun that transformed the case from lone wolf terrorism to coordinated political conspiracy. No individual acting alone organizes multi-party planning calls with members of Congress and private military contractors. Director Ray was now visibly uncomfortable. "Congresswoman, if such evidence exists, it would be part of an ongoing investigation that I cannot discuss in open session." "Cannot or will not?" Jasmine interrupted. "Because according to this DOJ internal memo, the decision was made to classify this evidence and exclude it from your public testimony to maintain political stability and avoid constitutional crisis." The memo was devastating because it suggested that law enforcement had deliberately concealed evidence of congressional involvement in the assassination attempt to protect political institutions rather than pursue justice. Furthermore, Jasmine continued, this classified addendum to your FBI report identifies by name the congressional offices that were in communication with Wellington before the attack. She held up a document that made several Republican committee members go pale. If their colleagues' names were on that list, their entire political party could be implicated in a conspiracy to assassinate the vice president. "Congresswoman," the committee chairman interrupted, "if this involves classified information, perhaps we should move to closed session." "Should we?" Jasmine asked pointedly. "Or should the American people know that the attack on their vice president wasn't the act of a lone wolf, but part of a coordinated conspiracy involving sitting members of Congress?" The question hung in the air like an accusation against everyone who had promoted the lone wolf narrative while knowing about evidence of broader conspiracy. Jasmine reached deeper into her folder and withdrew what appeared to be a digital device. This contains recordings of some of Wellington's phone conversations with congressional offices. The recordings were made automatically by NSA monitoring systems as part of routine national security surveillance. The existence of recorded conversations between the assassin and members of Congress was political dynamite. If authentic, the recordings could implicate sitting lawmakers in a conspiracy to assassinate the Vice President of the United States. Would the committee like to hear one of these recordings? Jasmine asked. The question created an impossible political dilemma. Refusing to hear the evidence would look like a cover-up, but hearing it could expose congressional involvement in attempted assassination. Before anyone could object, Jasmine connected the device to the hearing room's audio system. This is a conversation between Marcus Wellington and someone identified in NSA records as calling from the office of Senator Patricia Morrison, recorded on July 18, 6 weeks before the attack. The recording began with Wellington's voice, "I'm having second thoughts about the timeline. 6 weeks might not be enough preparation." Then came a voice that several committee members recognized, cultured, authoritative, unmistakably that of someone accustomed to political power. "Marcus, we've discussed this extensively. The timeline is fixed. The opportunity won't exist after the election. But if something goes wrong, if I'm caught. You won't be caught if you follow the plan exactly as we've outlined. And even if you are, remember that you're acting alone. No one forced you to make this decision. The conversation continued with the congressional contact providing detailed tactical advice about security vulnerabilities, timing considerations, and escape routes that would be impossible for Wellington to know without inside information. The most damaging exchange came near the end. What happens after? Wellington asked. What happens to me? You become a patriot who saved America from a dangerous radical, came the response. History will vindicate your sacrifice. And my family? The money we discussed? The compensation will be transferred as agreed. Your family will be well taken care of, and you'll have the best legal representation money can buy. When the recording ended, the silence in the hearing room was profound and terrible. This wasn't a lone wolf attack, it was a coordinated assassination plot involving elected officials, financial incentives, and institutional cover-up. But Jasmine wasn't finished. She reached for another recording that made the remaining color drain from several faces in the room. This is a conversation from August 5, involving Wellington and multiple participants in what NSA analysis identifies as a planning conference call. The second recording revealed the full scope of the conspiracy. Multiple voices, some clearly recognizable as prominent political figures, discussed operational details, financial arrangements, and political contingencies for the aftermath of the assassination. If the operation succeeds, one voice explained, we'll have a constitutional crisis that allows us to challenge the election results and potentially trigger new elections under more favorable circumstances. Another voice added, the key is ensuring Wellington appears to be an isolated radical rather than part of any organized effort. The narrative has to be mental illness and online radicalization. What about the vice president's security detail? Wellington asked. We have assets in place, came the response. There will be a window of opportunity during the rope line interaction. The security gap will last approximately 43 seconds. The level of detail and institutional knowledge revealed in the recordings made clear that this wasn't just a conspiracy involving individual congresspeople, it was a coordinated effort involving security personnel, political operatives, and elected officials at multiple levels of government. The final revelation came when Jasmine played excerpts from what she identified as financial coordination calls, where the assassination plot's funding and logistics were discussed. The operation budget is $15 million. One voice explained. $3 million for Wellington and his family, $2 million for security assets, $5 million for media management and narrative control, and $5 million for legal contingencies. The systematic financial planning revealed the assassination attempt as a professionally organized operation with the kind of budget and coordination typically associated with military or intelligence operations. The American people, Jasmine said as she concluded the audio evidence, were told that the attack on Vice President Harris was the isolated act of a mentally disturbed individual. But the evidence shows it was actually a $15 million conspiracy involving dozens of participants, including sitting members of Congress. She stood up, her movement commanding the attention of every person in the room. This wasn't terrorism, it was an attempted coup disguised as lone wolf violence. The goal wasn't just to assassinate the vice president, but to create a constitutional crisis that would allow the conspirators to challenge election results and potentially overturn democratic governance. The moral and constitutional implications were staggering. If sitting members of Congress had conspired to assassinate the vice president to create political opportunities for their party, it represented the most serious threat to American democracy since the Civil War. The cover-up, Jasmine continued, was as extensive as the original conspiracy. Evidence was classified, witnesses were silenced, and the American people were given a false narrative designed to protect the conspirators rather than expose the truth. Director Wray sat in stunned silence, his credibility destroyed by the revelation that his agency had participated in concealing evidence of congressional involvement in attempted assassination. The aftermath of Jasmine's revelations was swift and unprecedented. Within hours, federal marshals were executing arrest warrants for 7 sitting members of Congress, 3 senators, and dozens of staff members and contractors involved in the conspiracy. The arrests triggered the largest political crisis in American history, with questions about whether democratic institutions could survive the revelation that elected officials had conspired to assassinate the vice president. Vice President Harris, who had survived the assassination attempt, addressed the nation that evening. "The attack on me was not just an attack on one person," she said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what had been revealed. "It was an attack on democracy itself, carried out by people who had sworn an oath to defend the Constitution they were trying to destroy." She continued, "But democracy has survived because there are still people willing to seek truth over political convenience, justice over institutional protection, and accountability over comfortable lies." The trials that followed were watched by millions of Americans grappling with the reality that their own elected representatives had conspired to assassinate the vice president for political gain. The evidence presented during the trials was overwhelming: phone records, financial transfers, recorded conversations, and testimony from co-conspirators who agreed to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for reduced sentences. Senator Patricia Morrison, whose voice had been clearly identified on the NSA recordings, was convicted of conspiracy to commit assassination and sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. Representative Marcus Chen, who had coordinated much of the operational planning, received a similar sentence after the jury heard recordings of him discussing how to eliminate Harris permanently, for the good of the country. In total, 11 members of Congress were convicted and sentenced to lengthy prison terms for their roles in the conspiracy. The trials revealed a level of coordination and institutional corruption that shocked even seasoned observers of American politics. But perhaps the most significant outcome was the comprehensive reform of how political violence investigations were conducted and how evidence was handled when it implicated elected officials. The Harris Protection Act passed Congress with overwhelming bipartisan support, establishing independent special prosecutors for cases involving threats against constitutional officers and requiring full disclosure of evidence regardless of political implications. The law also created new oversight mechanisms for intelligence agencies to prevent the classification of evidence for political rather than national security purposes. Marcus Wellington, the would-be assassin who had been portrayed as a lone wolf, received a reduced sentence in exchange for his cooperation in exposing the broader conspiracy. His testimony revealed the extent to which he had been manipulated and directed by elected officials who promised him money, legal protection, and historical vindication. "I thought I was saving America," Wellington said during his sentencing hearing. "But I was just a weapon being used by people who wanted to destroy democracy to increase their own power." The 44 seconds that had begun with Wellington's claim of acting alone had exposed the most extensive political conspiracy in American history and had fundamentally changed how the country understood the relationship between political rhetoric and political violence. Jasmine Crockett, whose investigation had exposed the conspiracy and prevented a successful cover-up, reflected on the case during a speech at the National Security Forum. "The attack on Vice President Harris wasn't an isolated incident," she told an audience of security professionals and government officials. "It was a test of whether our democratic institutions would prioritize truth over political convenience when the stakes were at their highest." She concluded with words that had become a rallying cry for democratic accountability: "Democracy doesn't protect itself. It requires constant vigilance, fearless investigation, and the courage to pursue truth wherever it leads, even when it leads to the highest levels of our own government." The conspiracy to assassinate Vice President Harris had been the gravest threat to American democracy in modern history. But the exposure of that conspiracy had also demonstrated the resilience of democratic institutions when they were defended by people willing to choose truth over political loyalty. Sometimes, the darkest moments in democratic history create the brightest examples of democratic courage. The conspiracy to assassinate Kamala Harris had been a betrayal of everything America stood for. But the investigation that exposed it had shown what America could be when its defenders refused to let political convenience override constitutional duty. 44 seconds had revealed the truth behind the attack on Kamala. And that truth, however painful, had ultimately made American democracy stronger than the forces that had tried to destroy it. But the story was far from over. The exposure of the Congressional conspiracy had opened a Pandora's box that revealed the full extent of institutional corruption and political extremism that had been building in American politics for years. What Jasmine had uncovered wasn't just one assassination plot, it was evidence of a systematic effort to undermine democratic governance through violence, intimidation, and institutional capture. Within weeks of the arrests, federal investigators had uncovered what they called the Network, a sophisticated organization of elected officials, private military contractors, media figures, and wealthy donors who had been coordinating political violence and election manipulation for over a decade. The network's operations went far beyond the Harris assassination attempt. Internal documents seized during the arrests revealed plans for attacking other Democratic leaders, strategies for using violence to suppress voter turnout in key districts, and comprehensive schemes for using crisis events to justify emergency powers and constitutional violations. Dr. Sarah Martinez, the FBI's leading expert on domestic terrorism, testified before a special Senate committee about the scope of what investigators had discovered. What we uncovered wasn't just a conspiracy to assassinate the vice president, she explained, her voice heavy with the weight of her findings. It was a multi-year campaign to use political violence as a tool for gaining and maintaining power. The Harris attack was just the most visible part of a much larger operation. Her testimony included evidence that the network had been responsible for numerous incidents that had previously been attributed to isolated extremists or random violence. The 2022 attack on the Democratic Party headquarters in Arizona, the 2023 bombing of a voter registration center in Georgia, the 2024 assassination attempt on Senator Elizabeth Warren, all had been coordinated by the same organization that had tried to kill Vice President Harris. They operated like a terrorist organization, Dr. Martinez continued, but with the resources and institutional access of the U.S. government. They had members in Congress, contacts in law enforcement, relationships with military contractors, and funding from some of the wealthiest individuals in America. The financial investigation into the network revealed a funding structure that was staggering in its scope and sophistication. Over $347 million had been funneled through shell companies, dark money organizations, and cryptocurrency accounts to finance what internal documents called patriotic operations to preserve constitutional governance. The money had come from a network of billionaire donors who had convinced themselves that democratic elections could no longer be trusted to produce acceptable outcomes. Rather than accept electoral defeats, they had chosen to fund violence and constitutional subversion. Marcus Blackwood, one of the primary financiers whose cooperation agreement provided crucial evidence, testified about the mindset that had led wealthy Americans to fund assassination attempts. We believed that the Democratic Party had become an existential threat to American values, he said during his immunity hearing. We convinced ourselves that normal political processes were insufficient to address the crisis. We thought we were patriots saving the country from destruction. His testimony revealed how a group of some of America's wealthiest individuals had gradually escalated from funding negative political advertisements to financing literal attempts to murder elected officials. It started with opposition research and negative ads, Blackwood explained. But when those didn't produce the electoral results we wanted, we moved to voter suppression efforts. When those weren't sufficient, we began exploring what our consultants called direct action solutions. The euphemisms were chilling in their clinical detachment. Direct action solutions meant assassination. Patriotic operations meant terrorism. Constitutional preservation meant overthrowing democracy. The investigation also revealed the role of private military contractors in planning and executing the network's operations. Companies like Meridian Security Services and Blackwater Associates had provided tactical planning, weapons training, and operational support for attacks on democratic institutions. Colonel James Patterson, a former Special Operations officer who had worked for Meridian, testified about how military expertise was being used to attack American democracy. We were told we were conducting protective operations for constitutional governance, he said, his voice carrying the shame of someone who had realized too late what he had actually been doing. We provided tactical assessment, operational planning, and specialized training for what we were told were defensive operations. What kind of defensive operations? Asked Senator Bernie Sanders during Patterson's testimony. Teaching civilians how to conduct surveillance on elected officials. Planning entry and exit routes for government buildings. Identifying security vulnerabilities in campaign events and political rallies. The revelation that military contractors had been training domestic terrorists to attack American elected officials sent shockwaves through the defense establishment. Congressional investigations revealed that multiple defense contractors had been simultaneously working for the U.S. government while training extremists to attack that same government. But perhaps the most disturbing discovery was the extent to which the network had infiltrated law enforcement agencies. FBI Special Agent Michael Chen, who had been arrested as part of the conspiracy, had been providing inside information about federal investigations while helping coordinate attacks on the officials those investigations were supposed to protect. Agent Chen had access to threat assessments, security protocols, and investigative targets, explained FBI Director Christopher Wray during his follow-up testimony. He used that access to help the network avoid detection while providing them with intelligence they needed to plan successful attacks. The infiltration went beyond individual agents. Entire field offices in certain regions had been compromised, with multiple agents working together to protect network operations while undermining federal law enforcement efforts. The scope of institutional corruption was so extensive that President Biden was forced to order a comprehensive review of all federal law enforcement agencies, resulting in the dismissal or reassignment of over 400 agents and administrators whose loyalty to democratic institutions had been compromised. The media component of the network was equally sophisticated and disturbing. Internal documents revealed coordinated efforts to manipulate news coverage, social media narratives, and public opinion to justify political violence and prepare Americans for what the network called necessary constitutional adjustments. Television hosts, radio personalities, and social media influencers had been receiving millions of dollars to promote narratives that dehumanized democratic officials and suggested that violence against them was not just justified but patriotic. The revelation that some of America's most prominent media figures had been paid to promote assassination propaganda triggered a crisis of credibility that reshaped the entire media landscape. Cable news networks were forced to fire multiple hosts whose communications with network operatives had been revealed during the investigation. Radio stations lost advertisers and audiences as people realized they had been listening to paid assassination propaganda disguised as political commentary. Social media platforms implemented unprecedented content moderation policies after discovering that network operatives had been using their platforms to coordinate real-world violence while hiding behind protected political speech. The psychological manipulation techniques used by the network were particularly sophisticated. Dr. Jennifer Martinez, a deprogramming specialist who worked with former network supporters, testified about how ordinary Americans had been radicalized into supporting assassination and terrorism. The network understood that most Americans would never support political murder if it was presented honestly, she explained. So they developed sophisticated propaganda techniques that gradually normalized violence by presenting it as defensive action against existential threats. The process began with exaggerated claims about democratic policies being dangerous to American values. It escalated through increasingly extreme rhetoric that portrayed democratic officials as traitors, enemies, and threats to national survival. By the time people were being asked to support violence, Dr. Martinez continued, they had been conditioned to believe that they were defending America against people who wanted to destroy it. The network convinced them that assassination wasn't murder, it was patriotic self-defense. The psychological manipulation had been so effective that even after the conspiracy was exposed, many network supporters continued to believe that the assassinations had been justified and that the arrests represented persecution of patriots. Deprogramming centers were established across the country to help former network supporters reconnect with reality and abandon the violent ideologies they had been taught to embrace. The international implications of the network conspiracy were equally serious. Foreign intelligence agencies had been monitoring the organization's activities and had concluded that American democracy was more fragile than previously understood. Allies expressed private concerns about whether the United States could be trusted as a reliable partner when domestic extremists with government connections were attempting to assassinate elected officials. The Chinese and Russian governments, which had long criticized American democracy as unstable and hypocritical, pointed to the network conspiracy as evidence that the U.S. was incapable of governing itself effectively. "How can America lecture other countries about democracy and human rights?" asked Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Wang Wenbin, when its own elected officials are trying to murder each other. The diplomatic damage was severe enough that President Biden was forced to undertake a global reassurance tour, meeting with allied leaders to convince them that American democratic institutions were strong enough to survive the conspiracy and prevent future attacks. The legal proceedings against network members became the largest domestic terrorism prosecution in American history. Over 200 individuals were indicted on charges ranging from conspiracy to commit assassination to seditious conspiracy to treason. The trials revealed the full scope of how close the network had come to achieving its goals. Beyond the Harris assassination attempt, investigators discovered active plots against Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi, Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, and dozens of other Democratic officials. "We were approximately 6 weeks away from what the network called Restoration Day," testified FBI counterterrorism expert Sarah Wong. This would have involved simultaneous attacks on multiple Democratic leaders during the State of the Union address, creating a power vacuum that the network believed would allow them to implement emergency governance protocols. The Restoration Day plot involved infiltrating Capitol security, coordinating attacks during the constitutionally mandated joint session of Congress, and using the resulting chaos to justify martial law and suspended elections. The goal wasn't just to kill individual politicians, Wong explained. It was to decapitate the entire Democratic leadership structure and create a constitutional crisis that would allow network allies to seize power under emergency authorities. The plot had been scheduled for execution in March 2025, just 2 months after Jasmine's hearing had exposed the conspiracy. Her investigation had literally prevented a coup attempt disguised as a series of terrorist attacks. The psychological impact on the intended victims was profound and lasting. Vice President Harris, who had been the primary target, struggled with post-traumatic stress while continuing to fulfill her constitutional duties. "Knowing that people you served with in Congress were planning to murder you changes everything," she told Barbara Walters in an exclusive interview 6 months after the conspiracy was exposed. "You can't look at your colleagues the same way. You can't trust institutions the same way. You can't assume that people's political disagreements don't extend to wanting you dead." The attack had also affected her family, particularly her husband Doug Emhoff and her stepchildren, who required extensive security protection and psychological counseling to cope with the knowledge that their family member had been targeted for assassination by government officials. But Harris also spoke about the importance of not allowing terrorism to achieve its goals of destroying democratic governance. "They wanted to kill me not just as an individual, but as a symbol of democratic legitimacy," she said. "The best way to honor the people who saved my life and expose this conspiracy is to continue doing the work of democracy, to keep serving, keep fighting for the values they tried to destroy through violence." Her courage in continuing to serve despite the assassination attempt became a symbol of democratic resilience that inspired Americans across the political spectrum. The elections that followed the network conspiracy exposure saw unprecedented voter turnout as Americans who had been politically disengaged were mobilized by the realization that democracy required active defense against internal threats. Many of the congressional seats vacated by network conspirators were won by candidates who campaigned explicitly on democratic protection and institutional reform themes. The new members of Congress, many of whom had been motivated to run specifically because of the conspiracy, brought a sense of urgency about protecting democratic institutions that had been missing from American politics for decades. Comprehensive legislative reforms were passed to prevent future network-style conspiracies. The Democratic Protection Act established new oversight mechanisms for private military contractors, enhanced screening for federal law enforcement positions, and created independent monitoring of political violence. The law also established the Federal Democracy Protection Agency, an independent organization with the power to investigate threats to democratic institutions and coordinate responses to domestic terrorism targeting elected officials. Perhaps most importantly, the legislation created new educational requirements for civic engagement, ensuring that future generations of Americans would understand both the value of democratic institutions and their vulnerability to internal threats. The network conspiracy had been the greatest threat to American democracy since the Civil War. But the response to that threat had strengthened democratic institutions in ways that made them more resilient to future attacks. Law enforcement agencies were purged of extremist sympathizers and restructured to prevent infiltration by anti-democratic elements. Media organizations implemented new standards for identifying and rejecting paid propaganda designed to incite violence. Educational institutions developed new curricula focused on teaching students how to recognize and resist political manipulation designed to normalize violence against democratic institutions. Most importantly, the American people had learned that democracy was not self-sustaining. It required constant vigilance, active participation, and willingness to defend constitutional principles against those who would destroy them for political gain. 5 years after Jasmine Crockett's 44 seconds of questioning had exposed the conspiracy, America had been fundamentally transformed. The naive assumption that political disagreements would never escalate to assassination attempts had been shattered, but it had been replaced by a more mature understanding of democracy's requirements and vulnerabilities. Children who had grown up during the network crisis learned in school about the importance of institutional loyalty over partisan loyalty, about the dangers of political extremism, and about the civic duty to protect democratic institutions from internal threats. Political candidates were required to undergo background investigations that screened for connections to violent extremist organizations. Campaign finance laws were strengthened to prevent the kind of dark money funding that had enabled network operations. Media literacy became a core educational requirement, ensuring that future generations would be better equipped to identify propaganda designed to manipulate them into supporting violence against democratic institutions. The transformation wasn't complete. No society ever achieves perfect democracy, but it represented a fundamental shift toward recognition that democratic freedom required active defense against those who would destroy it. Jasmine Crockett, whose investigation had prevented what could have been the end of American democracy, reflected on the changes during the 5th anniversary commemoration of the network's exposure. The conspiracy to assassinate Vice President Harris wasn't just an attack on one person, she told a national television audience. It was an attack on the idea that Americans could govern themselves through peaceful, democratic means. She continued with words that had become a rallying cry for democratic renewal, but democracy survived because enough people chose truth over comfort, justice over party loyalty, and constitutional duty over political convenience. The network conspirators forgot that democracy's greatest strength isn't its institutions, it's the people who are willing to defend those institutions when they're under attack. The audience watching her anniversary speech included many of the people whose courage had saved American democracy, whistleblowers who had provided evidence, investigators who had followed the evidence wherever it led, journalists who had reported the truth despite pressure to minimize the story, and ordinary citizens who had demanded accountability rather than accepting comfortable lies. The conspiracy to assassinate Kamala Harris had been defeated not by any single hero, but by a democratic system that proved capable of defending itself when its defenders chose principle over party and truth over power. The 44 seconds that had begun with a lie about a lone wolf attacker had ended with the exposure of the most sophisticated domestic terrorism conspiracy in American history. But those same 44 seconds had also begun the process of democratic renewal that had made American institutions stronger, more transparent, and more resilient than they had been before the attack. Sometimes, democracy's greatest victories come not from preventing attacks against it, but from surviving those attacks and emerging stronger on the other side. The network had tried to destroy American democracy through violence and deception. Instead, they had accidentally strengthened it by forcing Americans to confront the truth about their institutions' vulnerabilities and their own responsibilities as democratic citizens. 44 seconds had changed everything. And in the end, everything had changed for the better.